The rain fell in sheets against the windows of the Ashford townhouse that November evening, each drop a small percussion against glass, already fogged with the chill of approaching winter. London lay beneath a blanket of grey that seemed to seep through stone and timber alike, settling into the bones of the city and all who dwelt within it. In the drawing-room of the once grand residence on Belgrave Square, Lady Eleanor Ashford sat with her embroidery untouched in her lap, watching the rivulets trace their erratic paths downward, each one a small surrender to gravity's inexorable pull. She was 24, an age that whispered of spinsterhood in the drawing-rooms of society, though her face retained the quiet beauty that had once prompted comparisons to Botticelli's Venus, pale, serene, touched with an otherworldly quality that seemed to hold her apart from the frivolous concerns of other young women. Her dark hair was dressed simply, without the elaborate curls that fashion demanded, and her gown, though well made, bore the subtle signs of having been turned and refreshed, and the silk not quite as lustrous as it had been 3 seasons prior. The house itself echoed this genteel decline. The gilt on the mirror frames had dulled, the carpet showed wear near the doorways, and the fire in the grate burned lower than comfort dictated, for coal had become an expense requiring consideration. Eleanor had watched her family's fortune ebb like tide retreating from shore, each year carrying away a little more of what had once seemed permanent and unshakable. Her father, Lord Ashford, had made unfortunate investments, a canal venture that had failed, a partnership in a shipping concern that had foundered both literally and financially. Her mother had passed 4 years earlier, taking with her the last true warmth the house had known, leaving behind a father who retreated into his study, and a daughter who had learned to shoulder burdens with the quiet dignity her mother had modelled. The sound of the front door opening, of voices in the hall, her father's and another, unfamiliar, pulled Eleanor from her reverie. She set aside the embroidery and rose, smoothing her skirts with hands that had learned not to tremble, though her heart had begun its anxious flutter. There was something in the quality of the voices, in the heavy tread of her father's footsteps, that spoke of finality. When Lord Ashford entered the drawing-room, his face was ashen, his cravat askew, and in his hand he carried papers that seemed to weigh more than their physical substance could account for. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice cracked on her name like ice breaking on the Thames. "My dear girl, I fear I have brought us to ruin. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal. Now, let's begin." The Duke of Thornfield arrived at the solicitor's offices on a Tuesday morning, when frost still clung to the windows like crystalline lace, and London held its breath beneath a sky the colour of pewter. Adrian Blackwood was a man whom society had long since ceased trying to warm, for he moved through the world with the impenetrable chill of winter itself. At 32, he possessed the kind of austere handsomeness that painters favoured for portraits of medieval saints, all sharp planes and severe angles, dark hair kept ruthlessly controlled, eyes of such pale grey they seemed almost colourless in certain lights, like ice over deep water. He wore his title as he wore his perfectly tailored coat, with absolute correctness and no apparent pleasure. They called him the Ice Duke in the drawing-rooms and gentlemen's clubs, spoke of how he had not smiled since his mother's death 2 years prior, how he moved through ballrooms like a ghost, dancing only when duty demanded, and speaking only when silence would constitute rudeness. His estates were impeccably managed, his business ventures coldly brilliant, his person entirely unapproachable. When he entered the panelled room where Lord Ashford and the solicitors waited, the very air seemed to drop several degrees. Eleanor had been summoned to attend, though she understood she was not expected to speak, merely to be observed, assessed, and if found adequate, acquired. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her spine straight, her face composed into the serene mask she had perfected over years of enduring society's subtle cruelties. Adrian's gaze swept over her once, thorough and dispassionate as a botanist examining a specimen, and she felt the clinical nature of that assessment like a chill wind against her skin. He took his seat across the mahogany table, and the solicitors began their recitation of terms. Lord Ashford's debts would be assumed. The Ashford family would retain their townhouse for Lady Eleanor's father's lifetime. A generous settlement would be provided for the lady herself, and in return, the Duke would acquire a wife of appropriate breeding to provide him with the heir his title required. Nementor. The words echoed in the high-ceilinged room. Assume, acquire, require the vocabulary of commerce rather than matrimony. Adrian listened without expression, his pale eyes occasionally drifting back to Eleanor as one might glance at a painting being offered for purchase, considering whether it would suit the space intended for it. "The lady understands the nature of this arrangement?" he asked finally, his voice deep and precisely modulated, devoid of warmth. "She does, Your Grace," Lord Ashford answered, and Eleanor felt the shame of being spoken for, even as she understood the necessity. Adrian nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than approval. "Then we are agreed," he said, and reached for the pen to sign away his freedom and hers in strokes of ink, as black and final as a funeral shroud. 3 days after the signing of the documents, Eleanor was summoned to meet the Duke at his London residence, an imposing structure on Grosvenor Square that seemed to reject the very notion of welcome. The butler who admitted her moved with the hushed efficiency of one accustomed to a household where laughter had been banished, and Eleanor found herself conducted through halls lined with portraits of Blackwood ancestors who stared down with expressions ranging from stern to severe, as though disapproval had been bred into the family bloodline along with their distinctive pale eyes. Adrian received her in his study, a room of dark wood and leather that smelled of old books and beeswax, where the fire burned low and seemed to provide light without warmth. He stood as she entered, observing the proprieties with mechanical precision, and gestured to the chair before his desk. Eleanor sat, her back straight, her hands folded, and waited for him to speak first, as custom demanded. When he did, his words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that would alter everything they touched. "Lady Eleanor," he began, his tone as neutral as if discussing agricultural yields, "I believe it necessary that we establish clear understanding between us from the outset. This is merely a marriage of convenience. I require an heir, you require security. Let us not pretend otherwise. I do not offer you affection, nor do I expect it in return. We shall maintain separate chambers, meet for meals when social obligations demand it, and otherwise pursue our own interests within the bounds of propriety. Your duties will be to manage the household, appear at my side when required, and provide the necessary heir. In return, you will want for nothing materially, and will have the protection of my name. Is this acceptable to you?" Eleanor had known, of course, that this was the nature of their arrangement, but hearing it spoken with such brutal clarity, such complete absence of any gentle pretense, struck her with unexpected force. She met his pale eyes, those eyes that seemed to look through her rather than at her, and found her voice steady when she spoke. "It is acceptable, Your Grace," she said quietly, and watched something flicker in his expression, too quick to name surprise perhaps, or was it disappointment, before the mask of ice descended once more. "Very well," he replied, and rose to indicate the interview had concluded. The engagement was announced in the Times the following morning, and by afternoon, every drawing-room in London hummed with speculation. The Ice Duke to marry at last, and to Lord Ashford's daughter no less. The arrangement was transparent as glass, charity dressed in the guise of matrimony, a business transaction masquerading as a love match. Eleanor endured the congratulations that felt like condolences, the pitying glances, the whispered observations about how pale she looked, how composed, how very much like a martyr proceeding to her fate with admirable fortitude. The weeks preceding the wedding passed in a blur of fittings and arrangements that felt less like preparation for a new life than rehearsal for a performance in which Eleanor had been cast without audition. Her wedding gown was created in ivory silk, beautiful and austere, adorned with Brussels lace that had belonged to some distant Blackwood ancestor, as though even her attire must proclaim her assimilation into a family whose warmth had long since fled. She stood for hours while the modiste pinned and tucked, transforming her into an appropriate ornament for a duke's collection, and found herself thinking of her mother, who had married for love and had been radiant even in her final days, sustained by the memory of that love, like a flame that refused to gutter. Eleanor knew she would have no such sustenance. She was entering a mausoleum, not a marriage. It was during one of these preparatory visits to Thornfield House that she learned of the late Duchess. The housekeeper, Mrs. Hartwell, a woman whose kind eyes seemed incongruous in that cold household, had been showing Eleanor the rooms she would oversee, and had paused before a portrait in the long gallery. "The late Duchess," she said softly, and Eleanor found herself gazing at a woman of perhaps 50, with warm eyes and a smile that seemed to illuminate the canvas from within. She passed 2 years ago this winter. The house has not been the same since, my lady, nor has his grace. Eleanor studied the portrait, this woman who had somehow produced a son of such chilling reserve, and felt an unexpected kinship with someone she would never know. She was beloved, I gather? Eleanor asked. Oh yes, my lady. The very heart of this house. His grace was different then. Before, Mrs. Hartwell caught herself, the practiced discretion of long service reasserting itself, but Eleanor had heard enough to understand that Adrian Blackwood had not always been ice. There were other glimpses, small fissures in the frozen facade that Eleanor collected like precious stones, though she dared not examine them too closely. The way Adrian's hand had trembled, barely perceptibly, when he placed the betrothal ring on her finger. The afternoon she had found him in the music room, standing motionless before the pianoforte, and had retreated before he noticed her presence, but not before she had seen the expression on his face, naked grief, that quickly shuttered when he sensed her approach. The wedding itself took place on a crystalline December morning, the church filled with flowers that seemed too vibrant for the solemnity of the occasion. Eleanor walked down the aisle on her father's arm, feeling as though she moved through a dream, and when she reached Adrian's side, she dared to look up at him. His face was impassive, carved from marble, but his eyes, those pale, cold eyes, held something she could not name, something that vanished the moment she tried to grasp it. They spoke their vows in voices that echoed in the vaulted space, and when Adrian placed the wedding band on her finger, his touch was brief and formal, the contact of a man handling something fragile and foreign. Thornfield Manor rose from the Yorkshire moors like a monument to endurance, its grey stone walls weathered by centuries of wind and rain, its many windows reflecting the winter sky with a coldness that matched the man who owned it. Eleanor arrived as the afternoon light was failing, the carriage wheels crunching over gravel that seemed to announce her intrusion into a place that had long since closed itself to joy. The house was larger than she had imagined, sprawling across the landscape with wings and additions that spoke of generations of Blackwoods, each leaving their mark in stone and timber. Adrian handed her down from the carriage with the same distant courtesy he had shown throughout their brief wedding breakfast, his touch impersonal, his face unreadable, and then he was striding ahead, leaving her to follow in his wake like a retainer rather than a wife. The servants assembled in the great hall, a vast space of vaulted ceilings and ancestral shields, and Eleanor was introduced to them one by one, their names and functions washing over her in a tide she struggled to retain. Mrs. Hartwell was there, having travelled ahead to prepare the household, and her kind smile was the only warmth Eleanor encountered in that cathedral of cold formality. Adrian excused himself almost immediately, citing estate business that required his attention, and Eleanor was left to be shown to her chambers by the housekeeper, aware that her husband had not even indicated where his own rooms were located, as if the question of proximity was irrelevant to their arrangement. Her apartments were beautiful in the way museums are beautiful, perfectly appointed, exquisitely furnished, utterly lifeless. The bedroom was done in shades of cream and pale blue, the sitting room lined with books she suspected no one had read in decades, and everywhere the sense that she was merely the latest temporary inhabitant of spaces that belonged fundamentally to the past. The following days established a pattern that Eleanor understood would define her existence at Thornfield. Adrian appeared at breakfast and dinner with clockwork regularity, conversed with perfect politeness about neutral subjects, and then disappeared into his study or out onto the estate, leaving her to occupy herself as best she could. She took to exploring the manor, walking its long corridors and investigating its many rooms, searching perhaps for some sign of life in this mausoleum, some indication that warmth had once existed here. It was during one such exploration, 3 weeks into her marriage, that Eleanor discovered the locked door. It was located in the west wing, at the end of a corridor lined with family portraits, and unlike every other door she had tried, this one resisted her touch. The handle turned, but the door itself held fast, and when she knelt to peer through the keyhole, she saw only darkness and the suggestion of dust motes dancing in whatever light penetrated the shuttered windows beyond. "Those were Her Grace's chambers," came Mrs. Hartwell's voice behind her, gentle but firm. "His Grace keeps them locked. No one enters there, my lady, not since the Duchess passed." The weeks accumulated like snow on the moors, each one adding another layer of cold familiarity to Eleanor's existence at Thornfield. She learned the rhythm of Adrian's life as one learns the ticking of a clock constant, predictable, emotionless. He rose before dawn and rode across the estate regardless of weather, returning for breakfast at precisely 8 o'clock, his dark hair damp from exertion or rain, his face still closed as a shuttered house. They ate in silence, broken only by the clink of silver against porcelain, or by Adrian's occasional observations about estate matters, delivered in tones so neutral they could have been discussing the weather rather than the lives and livelihoods of the people who depended upon him. Eleanor responded with equal formality, and the distance between them at opposite ends of the dining table seemed to stretch far beyond the physical feat of polished mahogany. Dinner was much the same, though by then Adrian had often spent hours in his study, emerging only when duty demanded, and Eleanor had learned to fill her days with inspections of the household, correspondence with her father, and long walks through rooms that echoed with her solitary footsteps. Yet despite the glacial remoteness of her husband, Eleanor found herself noticing small details that seemed to contradict the narrative society had written about the Ice Duke. She observed the way he spoke to the servants, not with the casual dismissiveness of most aristocrats, but with a consideration that bordered on gentleness. When young Thomas, the footman, had broken a valuable vase, trembling with terror at what punishment might descend, Adrian had merely asked if he was injured and instructed that the shards be cleared carefully to prevent further accident. She watched from the stairs as he spoke with Mrs. Hartwell about the illness of a tenant farmer's child, saw him write something quickly on a slip of paper, authorization for the doctor, she learned later, with instructions that all expenses be sent to him personally. These glimpses of something beneath the ice confused Eleanor, made her wonder what had frozen a man who seemed, in unguarded moments, capable of warmth. She noticed, too, his hours in the library, that sanctuary he retreated to most evenings while she sat alone in the drawing-room with her needlework. Once, passing by the door he had left slightly ajar, she had glimpsed him standing before the shelves, a book open in his hands, his face transformed by an expression of such profound sorrow that she had retreated quickly, feeling as though she had witnessed something too private for her eyes. And there was the portrait in the long gallery, the one of his mother that Mrs. Hartwell had shown her. Eleanor observed that Adrian's path through the house never took him past it, that he altered his route to avoid that corridor entirely, as though the painted eyes of the woman who had loved him were too painful to meet. The storm arrived on a January night when the wind howled across the moors like something wild and wounded, rattling the ancient windows of Thornfield and sending snow against the glass in waves that obscured the world beyond. Eleanor had been caught in the early edge of it during her afternoon walk, determined to escape the suffocating stillness of the house, and had returned chilled to the bone, her thin pelisse soaked through, her teeth chattering despite her attempts to appear unaffected when she encountered Adrian in the hall. He had frowned, the first genuine expression she had seen cross his face in weeks, and opened his mouth as if to speak, but she had hurried past him to her chambers, unwilling to endure a lecture on her foolishness. By evening, fever had taken hold with the swift brutality of winter itself, and Eleanor found herself lost in a landscape of heat and cold that made no sense, where the bedclothes were simultaneously suffocating and inadequate, where voices came from very far away, and her mother's face appeared in the shadows, smiling with that gentle sadness she had worn in her final days. She was aware, dimly, of Mrs. Hartwell's worried presence, of the doctor being summoned through the storm, of hands pressing cool cloths to her burning forehead. But what penetrated the fever's fog most clearly was the voice, Adrian's voice, stripped of its usual careful control, speaking her name with something that sounded almost like fear. "Eleanor, Eleanor, can you hear me?" When she managed to open her eyes, she found him sitting beside her bed, his cravat discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled back, his face haggard in the candlelight. It seemed impossible, this vision of the Ice Duke unmade, and she wondered if the fever had conjured him from her imagination. But his hand on her forehead was real, cool and gentle, and when he lifted a glass of water to her lips, supporting her head with unexpected tenderness, she knew he was no hallucination. "You must drink," he said softly, and there was something in his voice she had never heard before, not the neutral politeness of their dinners, but genuine concern, even tenderness. Through the 3 days that the fever raged, Adrian remained. She would surface occasionally from the delirium to find him there, always there, reading aloud in that deep voice from books she could not focus on but found soothing nonetheless. or simply sitting in watchful silence, his presence an anchor in the storm of her illness. He bathed her face and hands when the fever spiked, measured out the doctor's prescribed draughts with meticulous care, and once, when she cried out in the grip of some nightmare, she felt his hand close around hers, warm and steady and unutterably real. When the fever finally broke, and Eleanor woke to clear thoughts and winter sunlight streaming through gaps in the curtains, Adrian was asleep in the chair beside her bed, his dark head bowed, exhaustion written in every line of his body. She watched him for a long moment, this man who had nursed her with such devotion, and felt something shift in her chest, some barrier beginning to crack. But when he woke and saw her watching him, the mask descended once more, swift and complete as a curtain falling. He rose, inquired after her health with careful formality, and withdrew, leaving Eleanor to wonder if those 3 days had been fever dream after all. As February softened into March and the snow began its reluctant retreat from the moors, Eleanor found herself restored to health, but changed in ways she could not fully articulate. The fever had burned away some protective layer, leaving her more aware of the currents beneath the surface of her strange marriage, more attuned to the silent suffering of the man who shared her home yet remained a stranger. She could not return to passive acceptance, to merely haunting the manor's corridors like another ghost among many. When she approached Adrian about organizing the estate's charitable works, something she had learned the late Duchess had once overseen. He had looked at her for a long moment with those pale, unreadable eyes before giving his consent with a single nod. "Do as you see fit, Lady Thornfield," he had said, using her title for perhaps the first time. And Eleanor had heard in those words both permission and distance, as though he sought to keep her occupied and thereby safely removed from whatever fortress he maintained around his heart. But the work brought Eleanor into contact with the people of Thornfield in ways she had not anticipated, and through them she began to piece together the story of the woman whose locked chambers haunted the West Wing and whose absence had transformed a warm man into ice. Mrs. Hartwell proved an invaluable ally, accompanying Eleanor on visits to tenant families and speaking freely now that Eleanor had demonstrated genuine interest in their welfare. "The old Duchess," the housekeeper said one afternoon as they walked back from the village, "she had a way of making everyone feel seen, if you understand my meaning, my lady, not just noticed, but truly seen. His Grace was devoted to her, they were uncommonly close, as mothers and sons go. He would tell her everything, seek her counsel on all matters. She was his compass, you might say." The portrait Eleanor had seen captured only a fraction of the woman's warmth, she learned. The tenants spoke of her with a reverence that bordered on adoration, how she had established the school in the village, how she had personally tended the sick during an outbreak of influenza, how her laughter had echoed through Thornfield's halls and made even the grey stone seem less forbidding. And then, 2 years ago, while Adrian had been away in London attending to parliamentary duties, she had suffered a sudden apoplexy and died within hours, too quickly for word to reach him, too swiftly for goodbyes. "He came home to find her already in the ground," Mrs. Hartwell said quietly, her eyes moist with remembered grief. "Something broke in him that day, my lady. He locked away her rooms, forbade anyone to speak of her in his presence, and became, well, you know what he became. As if he thought that by feeling nothing, he could avoid feeling the pain of losing her." Spring arrived hesitantly on the Yorkshire moors, and with it came a subtle transformation in the dynamic between Eleanor and Adrian that neither acknowledged but both felt, like the first warmth in air that has been frozen for months. It began one evening when Eleanor, passing the library on her way to her solitary drawing-room exile, heard Adrian's voice from within, not speaking, but reading aloud, and she realized with a start that he was reading poetry, his deep voice giving life to Wordsworth's verses, with an emotion she had never heard him express in ordinary speech. She paused at the threshold, and he looked up, caught in the act of being something other than ice, and for a moment she thought he would shut the book and dismiss her with polite formality. Instead, after a pause that stretched like a held breath, he said, "Would you care to join me, Lady Thornfield? The fire is warm, and the evening long." It became, by unspoken agreement, their ritual. Each evening after dinner, they would repair to the library, that room of leather and old paper that smelled of knowledge and time, and occupy opposite chairs before the fire. At first they maintained silence, Eleanor with her needlework, Adrian with his books, But gradually words began to bridge the distance between them. Careful words at first, neutral observations about the estate or the weather, but slowly, incrementally, deepening into something more substantial. Adrian spoke of the history of Thornfield, of ancestors whose portraits lined the halls, and Eleanor began to understand that he carried the weight of generations. That duty was not merely an abstract concept, but a living presence that shaped his every decision. She, in turn, spoke of her love of literature, of how books had been her companions during lonely years of watching her family's decline, and she saw something flicker in his eyes, recognition perhaps, or kinship. He began to ask her opinions on matters of estate management, listening with genuine attention when she suggested improvements to the school or expansions to the charitable programs, and Eleanor felt the novel sensation of being valued for something beyond her bloodline or her ability to produce an heir. Small gestures accumulated like coins in a collection box, each one insignificant alone but together forming something of worth. Adrian began leaving books he thought she might enjoy on the table beside her chair. Eleanor ensured his favorite brandy was always available in the library. He asked about her father's health and seemed genuinely relieved when she reported improvement. She noticed when he seemed particularly burdened and would read aloud passages that might offer comfort or distraction. One evening, when rain lashed against the windows and thunder rolled across the moors, Adrian spoke suddenly into their comfortable silence. "You remind me of her sometimes. My mother, the way you listen, as if you truly hear what is being said beneath the words." Eleanor looked up from her embroidery to find him watching her with an expression that was almost vulnerable, and her heart constricted with understanding of what it cost him to make even that small revelation. The morning was unusually bright for April, sunlight streaming through the tall windows of the morning room where Eleanor had taken to arranging flowers from the estate's waking gardens, a task she had assumed, not from duty, but from the simple pleasure of bringing life and color into rooms that had been gray for too long. She was reaching behind the ornate console table to retrieve a fallen bloom when her fingers brushed against something small and metallic wedged in the narrow space between furniture and wall. Drawing it out, she found herself holding a key old iron, its bow elaborately wrought in a design that spoke of an earlier century. Eleanor turned it over in her palm, feeling the weight of it, the cool solidity, and something in her chest tightened with premonition even before conscious thought caught up with intuition. She knew, somehow, what door this key would open, though how it had come to be behind the console table was a mystery that would remain unsolved. Perhaps a servant had dropped it years ago during cleaning, and it had been forgotten. Or perhaps, and this thought sent a chill through her, the late Duchess herself had hidden it there, a secret kept even from her son. Eleanor stood motionless for a long moment, the key growing warm in her closed fist, while her mind waged a war between curiosity and conscience. The locked chambers in the West Wing had haunted her thoughts since her arrival at Thornfield. That forbidden space that represented everything, Adrian kept sealed away his grief, his past, and the man he had been before sorrow transformed him. To enter those rooms would be a violation, a breach of trust in a marriage that was only beginning to tentatively build something resembling trust. Yet Eleanor could not deny the pull she felt toward understanding, toward knowing the woman whose absence shaped everything at Thornfield, whose memory stood between Eleanor and any hope of reaching her husband's frozen heart. She told herself it was merely curiosity, but she knew it was more than that. It was the desperate need of a woman who had fallen, slowly and against all wisdom, in love with her husband, to understand what held him captive in the past. That afternoon, when Adrian had ridden out to inspect the northern fields, and the servants were occupied with their duties, Eleanor found herself standing before the locked door once more, the key trembling slightly in her hand. The corridor was silent, dust motes dancing in the shaft of sunlight that fell from the high window, and Eleanor could hear only the sound of her own breathing and the distant tick of the long case clock at the corridor's end. She fitted the key to the lock, felt it slide home with a click that seemed to echo through the house like a gunshot. The mechanism turned smoothly despite years of disuse, and the door swung inward with a whisper of displaced air, revealing darkness and the ghost scent of lavender and old roses. The room exhaled its secrets as Eleanor stepped across the threshold, and she found herself in a space frozen in time, preserved like an insect in amber, untouched by the 2 years that had passed since its occupant's death. Heavy curtains blocked most of the light, but what filtered through fell on furniture draped in Holland covers, on surfaces thick with dust that spoke of strict orders obeyed. No one had entered here to clean, to disturb, to acknowledge the relentless passage of time that waited for no one, not even a beloved duchess. Eleanor moved slowly through the sitting room, her heart hammering against her ribs with the twin sensations of transgression and discovery, each step a small violation and a small revelation. She drew back one of the curtains, letting spring light flood in, and the room seemed to wake reluctantly from its long sleep. The furnishings were elegant but comfortable, chosen for use rather than display a chaise covered in faded rose damask, bookshelves lined with volumes that showed signs of having been read and cherished, a writing desk positioned to catch the morning light. Everywhere Eleanor looked, she saw evidence of the woman who had inhabited this space, a shawl still draped over the back of a chair, as if its owner had just stepped out and might return at any moment, a half-finished piece of embroidery in a basket beside the hearth, letters stacked neatly on the mantelpiece, their seals unbroken, awaiting a reader who would never come. There was an intimacy to these abandoned objects that made Eleanor feel like an intruder at a shrine, yet she could not turn back, not now, not when she was so close to understanding. The writing desk drew her like a lodestone, and Eleanor found herself standing before it, looking down at its ordered surface, the dried inkwell, the scattered quills, the blotter still marked with backward impressions of words written long ago. And there, stacked with careful precision, were the diaries. 5 volumes bound in dark leather, each spine marked with dates in gold leaf that spanned more than 15 years of a woman's life, thoughts, and observations. Eleanor's hands trembled as she reached for the topmost volume, the most recent, and opened it to find pages covered in elegant script that slanted slightly to the right, the handwriting of someone who had written with both speed and grace. The entries were dated, the last one written 3 days before the Duchess's death, and Eleanor felt the weight of holding someone's private thoughts, their unguarded reflections meant for no eyes but their own. Every moral principle she had been raised with screamed against reading these intimate pages, against violating the privacy of the dead and the grief of the living. Yet, as her eyes fell on the first lines, Adrian writes that he will return next week. I must finish my arrangements before then, for time grows short, and there is still so much to do. Eleanor knew, with a certainty that both shamed and compelled her, that she would read every word. Eleanor became a thief of memory, stealing moments when Adrian rode out or closeted himself in his study to slip into the West Wing and lose herself in the world contained within those leather-bound volumes. She read with the curtains drawn against discovery, dust motes dancing in the thin shafts of light that penetrated the gloom, and with each page, the woman whose chambers these had been grew more vivid, more present, until Eleanor felt as though she could almost hear her voice speaking the words her hand had written. The Duchess Catherine, Eleanor learned, for she had signed entries with her given name in moments of particular emotion, wrote with clarity and warmth, her observations about estate life and society, interspersed with deeper reflections on philosophy, literature, and the nature of love itself. But it was the passages about Adrian that transformed Eleanor's understanding entirely, that revealed beneath the ice a man she had never known existed. Adrian returned from Oxford today. Read an entry from 15 years prior, and the house seems to burst with his energy and laughter. He has grown so tall, so handsome, yet retains that openness of heart that makes him beloved by all who know him. We spoke for hours in the library about his studies, his dreams of improving the estate and the lives of our tenants, his hope of finding a love match as his father and I did. He is all warmth and passion, my beautiful boy, and I pray he never loses that capacity for joy. Eleanor's hands shook as she read these words, trying to reconcile them with the frozen man she had married, the one who moved through life as though feeling itself were a weakness to be conquered. She read on, following Adrian through the years, his warm letters to his mother when away in London, his genuine care for those who depended upon him, his romantic nature that had led him to refuse several advantageous matches because he insisted, with youthful idealism, that he would marry only for love. And then came the entry that explained everything, written in script that wavered with emotion. The scandal has broken, and my heart breaks with it. Adrian loved her so completely, so trustingly, and she has betrayed him in the most public, most humiliating way possible, eloped with his closest friend, taking with her not only Adrian's heart, but his faith in humanity itself. He has locked himself away, refuses all comfort, and when I finally persuaded him to see me, the look in his eyes, "Oh, my dear boy, what have they done to you?" The warmth is gone, replaced by ice, and I fear I am watching my son die while still breathing. The later entries chronicled Catherine's growing concern, as Adrian rebuilt himself into something harder, colder, protected against ever feeling such pain again. But it was the final volume that made Eleanor's breath catch, for here the Duchess's tone shifted to something almost conspiratorial, urgent with purpose. "I must ensure Adrian finds love again before I am gone, for I feel time shortening," she had written 6 months before her death. "The plan is in motion, dear Margaret's daughter. Yes, that is the answer." Eleanor read through tears that blurred the elegant script, the revelation unfolding with the terrible clarity of truth that has been hidden but never truly absent. The late Duchess had known Eleanor's mother not casually, but deeply, intimately, as the closest of friends from their youth before marriage had taken them to different estates and different lives. The diaries spoke of letters exchanged over decades, of visits when possible, of a friendship that had sustained both women through the trials of their respective positions. Margaret writes that her situation grows dire, Catherine had noted 3 years prior, and my heart aches for her, watching her decline while knowing her family's fortune declines with her health. She worries constantly for Eleanor, that beautiful, intelligent girl who deserves so much more than the diminished circumstances she will inherit. I have promised Margaret I will watch over Eleanor should the worst occur, though I pray daily it does not. But Margaret Ashford had died, and Catherine had kept her promise in ways Eleanor was only now beginning to comprehend. The entries grew more specific, more purposeful, as Catherine's own health began to fail. The doctors speak in careful euphemisms, but I understand what they do not say. "I have perhaps a year, perhaps less. I must work quickly." Adrian needs someone who can reach past his defenses, someone with the patience and intelligence to see the man beneath the ice. Eleanor is that person. I know it, with the same certainty I knew when I first held Adrian as an infant, that he was destined for great love. She has her mother's gentle strength, her capacity for enduring devotion. Eleanor discovered that Catherine had quietly orchestrated the financial connections that would ensure Lord Ashford's debts eventually came to Adrian's attention, had carefully planted suggestions with solicitors, had even specified in her private instructions sealed letters delivered after her death, the exact terms that should be offered. It was manipulation of the most benevolent kind, a dying mother's desperate attempt to save her son from the frozen wasteland he had made of his life. "I will not live to see them wed," Catherine had written in one of her final entries, her handwriting showing the tremor of failing strength. "But I trust in what I know of Eleanor's character, and what I remember of Adrian's heart beneath the armor he has built. She will heal him. She has the patience to wait for spring, the courage to endure winter, and the wisdom to recognize that the coldest ice melts into the purest water. I leave them to each other with my blessing and my hope. Let this be my final gift to the son I love more than life, a woman worthy of his true heart and the chance to feel again." Eleanor sat motionless in the quiet room, the diary open in her lap, and felt the weight of a dead woman's love pressing down upon her, like a benediction and a burden both. The days that followed Eleanor's discovery were a peculiar torment, for she moved through her life at Thornfield, carrying knowledge that transformed everything yet changed nothing in the visible world. She sat across from Adrian at meals, watched him retreat behind his carefully maintained walls, listened to his polite observations about estate matters, and all the while her heart screamed with the truth. She could not speak that his mother had loved him enough to reach beyond death, that Eleanor herself was not merely the recipient of charity, but the object of a dying woman's hope, that the marriage she had entered with resignation was in fact a benediction carefully planned by hands now cold in the grave. Her feelings, which she had tried so desperately to keep contained within the bounds of wifely duty, grew wild and ungovernable now that she understood what lay beneath Adrian's ice. She looked at him and saw not the cold duke, but the warm young man he had been, the one betrayed and broken, the one who had loved so completely that the loss of that love had nearly destroyed him. She wanted to tell him that she knew, that she understood, that she would wait as long as necessary for him to feel safe enough to love again. But the knowledge had been stolen, obtained through violation of his grief, and Eleanor carried the guilt of that transgression like a stone in her chest. She returned to the chambers again and again, unable to stop herself, reading passages she had already memorized, searching Catherine's words for guidance on how to reach a man who had barricaded his heart against all invasion. It was during one such visit, on an afternoon when she had believed Adrian safely occupied with his steward reviewing accounts, that Eleanor heard footsteps in the corridor outside, footsteps she recognized with the intimate knowledge of one who has learned to chart another's movements, like a navigator reading stars. She froze, the diary still open in her hands, and watched with horror as the door swung wide and Adrian stood framed in the threshold, his face transforming from surprise to confusion to terrible, dawning comprehension. He looked from her to the room around them, the curtains she had drawn back, the dust she had disturbed, the evidence of repeated intrusion, and then his eyes fell upon the diary in her lap, and Eleanor watched the color drain from his face as though she had struck him. "What have you done?" he whispered, and the words were not a question but an accusation, raw with betrayal. "Adrian, please, I can explain," Eleanor began, rising. The diary clutched against her chest like a shield that could not possibly protect her. But he was already moving forward, his face contorted with an anguish that shattered the mask of ice completely, revealing the wounded man beneath, and Eleanor understood that she was witnessing the very thing he had spent 2 years ensuring no one would ever see again. Adrian Blackwood, feeling everything at once. "You had no right." Adrian's voice shattered the stillness like glass breaking, and Eleanor saw his hands trembling at his sides, clenched into fists, as though he fought against the impulse to tear the diary from her grasp, or perhaps to simply flee from this room and the memories it contained. This was hers, her private thoughts, her sanctuary, and you. His voice broke, and he turned away from her, his shoulders rigid with the effort of containing emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. "How dare you violate what I have kept sacred? How dare you trespass in the one place I asked to remain inviolate?" Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, but she did not move toward him, understanding that he was like a wounded animal, dangerous in his pain, and needing space to rage before he could hear reason. "I know I had no right," she said quietly, her voice steady despite her tears. "I know it was wrong, and I cannot ask your forgiveness for the violation. But Adrian, please, please listen to what she wrote. She wanted this. She wanted us." He spun to face her, his pale eyes blazing with anguish and anger both. "You know nothing. Nothing of what I have lost, what I have become. I kept my distance from you precisely to spare you from this, from me, from the broken shell of a man I am now. I gave you my name, my protection, my wealth. But I could not give you what I no longer possess the capacity to love, to feel, to be anything but this hollow mockery of what I once was. And now you have stolen even my right to that distance, invaded the last refuge where I could remember when I was whole." The words poured from him like blood from a wound too long festering, and Eleanor understood that she was witnessing the dam breaking, the ice finally cracking under the pressure of 2 years' accumulated grief. She moved closer, slowly, carefully, the diary open in her hands. "You are not broken," she said with a conviction that rang through the dusty air. "You are grieving, and your mother knew she understood what you needed, Adrian. Listen." She began to read, her voice clear and unwavering, the Duchess's words filling the space between them. "Adrian needs someone who can reach past his defenses, and someone with the patience and intelligence to see the man beneath the ice. Eleanor is that person. She will heal him. She has the patience to wait for spring, the courage to endure winter, and the wisdom to recognize that the coldest ice melts into the purest water." Adrian's face crumpled, and Eleanor watched as he sank into the chair his mother had once occupied, his hands covering his face, his body shaking with sobs he had not permitted himself in 2 years. "She left me," he choked out between gasping breaths. "She left me alone, and I could not, I cannot." Eleanor knelt before him, setting the diary aside, and took his hands in hers. "I was not here," Adrian said, his voice muffled against his hands, each word torn from somewhere deep within him. "She died alone because I was in London, attending pointless parliamentary sessions, concerning myself with matters of state while she... He looked up at Eleanor, his face ravaged by tears and guilt, and she saw in his pale eyes the terrible burden he had carried. The letter arrived too late. By the time I reached Thornfield, she was already buried. I never said goodbye. I never told her one final time that I loved her. I never asked her forgiveness for not being here when she needed me most. Eleanor's hands tightened around his, her own tears falling freely now. Adrian, she knew you loved her. Every word in these diaries speaks of her certainty of your love, and she forgave what needed no forgiveness you could not have known, could not have prevented what happened. But he was shaking his head, the words continuing to spill out, as though a floodgate had been opened that could not be closed. I lost Caroline to betrayal, lost my faith in love itself, and then I lost my mother, the only person who still believed I could be healed, who saw past the ice to the man I used to be. And I could not bear it, Eleanor. I could not survive another loss. So I froze everything, felt nothing, kept everyone at such distance that loss would be impossible because connection was impossible. He looked at her then with such naked vulnerability that Eleanor's heart constricted. When I married you, I told myself it was merely arrangement, that I could maintain the walls, that I could keep you safe from the wasteland I had become. But you, his voice broke again, you with your quiet patience, your gentle persistence, the way you listen as though you truly hear, the way you brought life back into these halls without demanding anything in return. You terrified me, Eleanor, because I felt the ice beginning to crack, and I knew that if I let myself care for you, if I let myself love you, I would be vulnerable again to the kind of pain that destroys. Eleanor drew a shuddering breath, gathering her courage, and spoke the truth she had been too afraid to acknowledge even to herself. I love you, Adrian, she said, her voice trembling but clear. I have been falling in love with you since that night you sat beside my sickbed, perhaps even before then. I love the man you are now scarred and guarded and trying so desperately to protect himself from further pain. And I love the man you were, the one your mother wrote about with such joy and pride. I love you knowing that love means risking loss, means making myself vulnerable to the kind of grief you have endured. But your mother was right. I would rather endure winter knowing spring might come than live in perpetual autumn, neither cold enough to freeze nor warm enough to bloom. Adrian stared at her, something crumbling in his expression, the last walls falling away. I am so afraid, he whispered. I know, Eleanor said simply, and drew him into her arms, felt him collapse against her with the surrender of a man who has fought too long and can fight no more. They held each other on the floor of his mother's chambers, surrounded by her preserved belongings and the diaries that had revealed her final act of love, and wept together for losses endured and futures almost abandoned. When they finally emerged, the afternoon light had shifted, and Eleanor understood that something fundamental had altered in the architecture of their marriage. Walls had fallen that could never be rebuilt, and in their place stood the terrifying, exhilarating possibility of genuine connection. The transformation did not happen all at once, for Adrian had spent 2 years building his fortifications, and dismantling them required patience and courage from them both. But slowly, like winter yielding to spring's persistent warmth, he began to thaw. He sought her out now, not from duty but from desire for her company, appearing in the morning room where she arranged flowers, or the library where she read, simply sitting near her as though her presence alone provided comfort. They talked in ways they had never talked before, not the careful, neutral exchanges of their early marriage, but genuine conversations about hopes and fears, about memories that brought both pain and joy, about the future they might build together if they were brave enough to try. It was Adrian who suggested they write to each other, a practice his mother had mentioned in her diaries as something she and Eleanor's mother had done during the long periods between visits. I find, he said with a vulnerability that still cost him visible effort, that I can sometimes express in writing what my tongue refuses to speak aloud. And so began an exchange of letters, left on pillows or tucked into books, missives that ranged from brief notes expressing simple affections to longer reflections on the complex emotions they navigated. Eleanor treasured each one, kept them in a box lined with silk, and wrote her own responses with care, letting her pen reveal the depths of feeling she had been forced to hide for so long. Spring arrived in earnest, transforming the moors from grey desolation to green abundance, and Eleanor could not help but see their own transformation reflected in nature's renewal. Adrian smiled now tentatively at first, as though the expression felt foreign on his face, but with increasing frequency, as joy became less frightening. He reached for her hand during their evening walks, held it as though it was something precious and fragile. He kissed her forehead in passing, her cheek when they parted for the night, And finally, one evening in the library where their friendship had first begun to grow, he kissed her lips with a tenderness that spoke of reverence and longing both. On a morning in late May, when the gardens bloomed with almost reckless abundance, they walked together to the small chapel on the estate grounds where generations of Blackwoods had wed and been laid to rest. Summer arrived like a benediction upon Thornfield, and Eleanor could scarcely recognize the estate she had first entered 8 months prior as a bride resigned to cold arrangement. The house itself seemed transformed, as though Adrian's returning warmth had literally heated the ancient stones. Laughter echoed in corridors that had known only silence. Windows stood open to admit light and air, and the servants moved with an ease that spoke of joy restored to a household that had mourned too long. Adrian was not the unguarded young man his mother's diaries had described, for grief had changed him in ways that could not be undone, but he had become something perhaps more valuable, a man who understood the fragility of love and therefore cherished it with conscious intention, who had learned through loss to appreciate each moment of connection as the precious gift it was. He smiled freely now, his pale eyes warm when they found Eleanor across a room, and he spoke of his feelings with an eloquence that suggested he was making up for 2 years of enforced silence. They worked together on the estate in ways that transcended the mere management of property, becoming true partners in the literal and metaphorical sense. Adrian sought Eleanor's counsel on all decisions, valuing her insights on tenant welfare and educational improvements, and Eleanor found herself flourishing in the role she had once thought would be mere performance. They expanded the village school, established a lending library, created employment programs for those in need, and in these endeavors, Eleanor saw the man Adrian would have become had tragedy not intervened. The compassionate visionary lord his mother had raised him to be, now tempered by an understanding of suffering that made his compassion more profound. Their evenings in the library became sacred time, hours spent in conversation or comfortable silence, reading aloud to each other, or simply being together in the way that lovers can be, finding completion in proximity. Adrian had moved his chambers to adjoin Eleanor's, the connecting door between them now always open, symbolic of the walls that had fallen and would not rise again. They spoke of the future now without the tentative hesitation that had marked their earlier attempts at connection children they hoped for, improvements they would make to Thornfield, travels they might undertake, and the long life they would build together. It was on an August evening, when the air hung heavy with the scent of roses and the last light gilded the moors with gold, that Eleanor told him. They were walking in the gardens his mother had designed, and Eleanor had been gathering courage all day, uncertain how to voice news that filled her with joy and trepidation both. Finally, she simply took his hand and placed it against her still flat abdomen and said, "There is someone who wishes to meet you, though it will be some months yet before the introduction can be made." Adrian had gone very still, his expression cycling through surprise, wonder, and finally a joy so profound it seemed to illuminate him from within. 3 autumns had passed since that spring when walls had crumbled and hearts had opened, and Thornfield Manor had become something its ancient stones had perhaps never witnessed, a house filled with laughter, warmth, and the particular chaos that accompanies young children discovering the world. Eleanor stood at the window of the morning room, her hand resting on the swell of her belly where their 3rd child grew, and watched as Adrian chased their daughter Catherine across the lawn, the little girl's delighted shrieks carrying on the September breeze. Their son, James, barely walking, toddled after them with the determined concentration of one newly mastered of his own legs, and Eleanor's heart swelled with a happiness so complete it sometimes frightened her with its intensity, as though joy this profound must surely be borrowed from some future sorrow. But she had learned, through Adrian's transformation and her own, that love required the courage to be vulnerable, to accept happiness without waiting for the other shoe to drop. The portrait of the late Duchess Catherine now hung in the great hall, where all who entered Thornfield would see it first, her warm eyes watching over the house she had loved, her smile seeming to bless the life that bloomed within these walls. Adrian had personally overseen its placement, and he spoke of his mother often now to their children, ensuring they would know the grandmother who had loved them before they were born, who had orchestrated their very existence through her final act of devotion. Her chambers were no longer locked, but had been transformed into a nursery where little Catherine slept, surrounded by the gentle presence of the woman whose name she bore. The diaries remained, but they had moved to the library, and Adrian and Eleanor read them together, now no longer a source of guilt or pain, but a treasured record of wisdom and love. Just that morning, before the children had woken, they had sat together in their usual chairs, and Adrian had read aloud one of his mother's passages. Love is not the absence of fear, but the choice to remain present, despite it. The heart that has been broken and healed is stronger than one that has never known fracture, for it understands its own resilience. Adrian had looked up from the page, his pale eyes bright with emotion, and said, "She was right about everything. About you. About us. About the fact that ice, no matter how thick, it will always yield eventually to patient warmth." Eleanor had smiled and taken his hand, this man who had been ice and had become fire, who had been broken and had become whole, who had closed his heart and had learned to open it again. They had built something rare and precious from the ashes of his grief and her resignation, a marriage that was not merely arrangement, but true partnership, not merely duty, but genuine devotion. The evening settled over Thornfield with the gentleness of a benediction. The September sky painted in shades of rose and gold that seemed to promise the world would always be this beautiful, this peaceful, this perfectly complete. Adrian sat in the library with Catherine on his lap, reading to her from the same volume of fairy tales his mother had once read to him, while James played at his feet with wooden blocks, constructing towers that defied architecture and gravity both. Eleanor entered carrying tea, her movements slower now with the weight she carried, and Adrian looked up at her with an expression that still, after 3 years, made her breath catch pure love, unguarded and unafraid, the look of a man who had found his way home after long wandering in the cold. She settled beside him, and Catherine immediately climbed into her lap as well, wedging herself between her parents with the confident possessiveness of a child who has never known anything but love. They sat together as the light faded and the first stars appeared, a family complete and whole, living in the house that had once been a mausoleum but had become a home, and Eleanor thought of the woman whose portrait smiled down from the great hall, whose diaries had shown the way, whose love had reached beyond death to heal her broken son and give him the future he had thought forever lost. Dear listener, perhaps you have learned by now that love arrives not always as we expect it, dressed in the romantic flourishes of novels and poetry, but sometimes as arrangement, as convenience, as cold transaction between families managing decline and duty. Yet beneath the surface of even the most pragmatic unions, there can lie seeds of genuine devotion waiting for the right conditions to bloom, patience like water, courage like sunlight, and time like the turning of seasons that cannot be rushed, but will not be denied. Adrian and Eleanor's story reminds us that those who love us work for our happiness in ways we may never fully comprehend, that sometimes the greatest acts of devotion are the quiet orchestrations that bring together hearts that need each other, even when those hearts do not yet know their own need. A mother's dying wish, a carefully preserved diary, a key left where it might be found. These were not accidents but intentions, love reaching forward into a future she would never see, trusting that patience and truth would ultimately prevail over grief and fear. Look beneath surfaces, dear one, for the world is rarely as cold as it first appears. The person who seems unreachable may simply be protecting a heart too wounded to risk further breaking. The arrangement that feels like resignation may be the very thing that saves you, and time, that most patient of healers, will reveal what force and urgency never could. That ice, no matter how thick, cannot withstand the persistent warmth of genuine love. May you find the courage to wait for spring, the wisdom to see beneath winter's harsh exterior, and the faith to trust that those who love you, whether living or passed beyond, work always for your ultimate joy. May your own heart, whether frozen or flourishing, find its way home. Rest well, dear listener, and remember the coldest ice melts into the purest water, and every ending contains within it the seeds of new beginning. This story was brought to you with love. If it touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear that patience and love can heal even the deepest wounds. Until we meet again in another tale, may your days be warm and your nights peaceful.